episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. Now, in case you were not paying attention this week, Apple just announced a slew of new updates to their chips, their Macs, iPads, displays, a whole bunch of stuff got announced this week, all in quick succession. So we got a lot to talk about. But also, Cisco is back at it again with a couple more perfect scores on some CVEs, which, in case you're not aware, that's something that you don't want to have happen. And Microsoft also had probably one of the most head-scratching remote code execution vulnerabilities that at least I've ever seen. And not to bury the lead in for this episode, because you probably read the topic for the title for this episode and saw, did Apple just kill the iPad? The short answer for that is no, they did not. So don't worry, iPad lovers, they did not kill the iPad. At least not yet, but we will talk about that later on in the episode. But speaking of CVEs, that leads us into our trivia question for the week. So, according to the GitHub repository for CVE.org, the first CVE submitted was CVE 1999-0211 on September 29th, 1999. But what was the CVE for? So, what was the first CVE that was submitted to CVE.org's GitHub repository? And that is your trivia question for the week. Now, before we get into the cybersecurity tip, we have to talk about Microsoft again, because they had one of the most head-scratching vulnerabilities that I've ever seen. Now, I would appreciate if someone could please explain to me how a text editor can have a remote code execution vulnerability in it. Yes, you heard me correctly. A text editor has a remote code execution vulnerability, or I guess it did. It's a text editor. The entire point of the text editor is to display text in a window. That is its sole job. So how in the world can you have a remote code execution vulnerability in a text editor? Well, apparently Microsoft found a way to accomplish such a fantastic feat, because they recently decided in an update back in either early February, end of January, something like that they wanted to add Markdown support to Notepad. Why they wanted to do this, I don't know, but this is where the little bit of an oopsie was introduced by Microsoft. So, while the text editor's sole job is to just open up a raw file and display its raw contents and allow you to edit and save them, the remote code execution vulnerability happens when Microsoft tried to display and allow for Markdown editing, but again, the sole job of a text editor is to open a file, display raw contents, and allow you to edit and save them, and yet it has a remote code execution vulnerability. Let that sink in. Oh, hello? Oh, shoot, yeah, it's the sink. Here, sink, come on in. Sorry, I had to let the sink in there. But yes, so first off, the only interaction that a text editor should ever have with the operating system is system calls to read and write files. That should literally be its only purpose, right? And anything else than that, you can block it at the operating system level. Oh, our text editor, which is Microsoft owned, by the way, is trying to make some network calls. Probably don't want to do that. Although we should also note that with how much Microsoft MS365 Microsoft account integration Microsoft's trying to shove down everyone's throats in Windows these days, basically everything is connected to the internet, which is rather unfortunate. I do miss the days where Notepad was literally just a super dumb text editor. I remember fondly trying to write programs in Notepad and struggling and being very annoyed because how primitive it was, which kind of had some appeal to it. But nowadays, it's much more complex. There's Copilot integration, Markdown integration. There's a whole bunch of stuff, different tabs, and it's kind of ballooning, and it's getting to the point where I think some people would agree, I among them, it's getting more features than it needs. Like there's an idea in software where software gets to a point of maturity where it doesn't need any more new features because it already does everything that it needs to do. And Notepad was there, oh, I don't know, back at like the some of the first generations of Windows. I mean, and it was basically unchanged for the longest time until they started deciding let's just throw all these new features in it. But yeah, so anyway, the point of a text editor should only to make read and write system calls for to the OS to basically say, "Hey, I need to read this file because the user wants to open it." And then when the user, saves the file, "Hey, operating system, I need to write to this file because the user requested to save the file." That's literally all it should do. Now, any other system calls to do any kind of command injection, that's basically how this vulnerability uh happened. Is the TLDR is there was essentially a command injection vulnerability going on, which there shouldn't be, but somehow Microsoft found a way to make that happen. And the thing is again, I know I'm harping on Microsoft here, but how badly do you have to mess up your implementation that you accidentally allow someone to click a malicious link in a markdown file in an open text editor, which then allows a threat actor to exploit a remote execution vulnerability to launch quote unquote unverified protocols and load and execute files with the user permissions. Now, the good news is it's not like the execution vulnerability is executing as root or like super admin or anything like that. But let's be honest, most people, when they run Windows computers, if it's a personal computer, they're an administrator of their computer anyway. So the threat actor would theoretically have the same admin privileges. But I touched on this before. This is just a command injection vulnerability. So the fact that Notepad, so basically what was going on is Notepad was basically trying to reach out to the address listed in the markdown link, and it was basically getting piped into it was essentially getting piped into a system call through a kind of a weird way of doing it. Which basically allowed the threat actor to maliciously set up that link to, say, go navigate to a remote file share or something, and then it would like pull down the file and execute code and stuff. But the fact that this was even possible in the first place is still kind of mind-boggling to me, because at the OS level, you should have some kind of, protections in place. And heck, you could even do this with Microsoft Defender. I'm not sure how Microsoft Defender didn't catch this. I mean, I'm sure it probably does now because, Microsoft knows about it and everything. But a text editor trying to do some weird, funky networking stuff, that should be a red flag to anyone. And especially if you own the whole top down of the OS like Microsoft does. It's not like this is like Notepad++ or something that's a third party app. No, this is a Microsoft owned app. So the fact that this can happen is just crazy. Now, sure, now, this is kind of the only. So my theory behind how Microsoft could have gone around this without having to have this, command injection essentially, is all that they have to do is get the default web browser, or in Microsoft's case, what they would probably do is just open Edge because they're Microsoft, and then just dump whatever it is into, the default web browser, and be done with it. But that's not exactly what's happening because web browsers have the ability to take command line arguments and auto open web pages for you. So you don't even need to make a system call to, launch the browser and what well, I guess you still technically do. But you just have to, give the web browser, pass it the URL, and then bingo presto, there's your command injection vulnerability. So, so essentially that's like a simple they didn't do like a simple regex expression or a regular expression to basically validate that the URL that's being passed to the web browser is actually valid. So essentially what's going on here is they're being like, edge and then say dash u URL. Don't know if that's the syntax, but dash u for the URL and then just pipe that to a system command, and not even bothering to validate that the URL that's passed is actually the URL, because if you're just passing it straight to a command, you could pass some arbitrary garbage and then do like basically append another command to the end of that to basically do whatever the heck you wanted. And that's kind of how the command injection worked in this case. And the thing that I still don't understand is I feel like that should be something that would have been very easy for Microsoft to not allow to have happen. But again, because of all of the network integrations that Microsoft is doing across the entire operating system, which in my opinion is very dumb, a text editor does not need access to the internet. It only needs the ability to read and write files. I guess if you're trying to do Markdown, then you do have to have the ability to open up the web browser, I guess. But the scope of accessing, as Microsoft put it in disclosing this vulnerability, unverified protocols, the operating system should easily be able to detect that it's trying to do something that it shouldn't be doing, i.e., using a unverified protocol, and just kill it right then and there and just block it from happening and not, accept the request and handle it. So how this, slipped through the cracks, there's a couple different notable areas of where, there was definitely some things that were missed, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But again, the fact that this actually exists in the first place is still kind of mind-boggling because, again, this is Notepad. It's supposed to be a text editor. But yet here we are. But speaking of vulnerabilities, that brings us into our cybersecurity tip for the week. So we've probably had this one before. I'm sure we've had this one before, and that is to update your Cisco firewalls and just your Cisco devices, because Cisco is back at it again. It's been a while since we've talked about Cisco, but they are back at it again with some perfect 10 out of 10 CVE scores. So both of the vulnerabilities that were disclosed this week can be exploited remotely by unauthenticated attackers. The authentication bypass flaw, which is CVE 2026-20079, allows attackers to gain root access to the underlying operating system, while the remote code execution vulnerability, which is CVE 2026-20131, lets them execute arbitrary Java code as root on unpatched devices. So Cisco stated that, quote, an attacker could exploit this vulnerability by sending a crafted serialized Java object to the web-based management interface of an affected device. A successful exploit could allow the attacker to execute arbitrary code on the device and elevated privileges to root. So they didn't give any specifics per se about the exact attack vector here, just that a malicious file could be uploaded, which to me that just kind of smells like another failure to validate incoming user input issue and then just piping that directly to being executed. That's kind of what this smells like to me, which isn't out of the ordinary for Cisco. They've had this happen on numerous occasions in the past couple years, which we've talked about. So Yeah, the thing of it is whenever it comes to dealing with user input, the best piece of advice I can give anyone is to always assume that anything that you are given that you personally did not generate in your code is malicious. And even better than that, just assume everything coming into your function is malicious, because even though you don't necessarily think, or you can't think of an exact use case where input coming into a function of yours would potentially be malicious, because as it looks like through the stack traces that all the functions that call this function are ones that you created and there's no user input being passed there always potentially could be some edge case you're not thinking about, which is sometimes how these vulnerabilities tend to creep up, where some unvetted user input kind of finds its way into that function, and if you don't actually verify it, you're kind of toast, because it's kind of this it goes back to this idea of zero trust, right? Any input, you always assume that the thing is untrusted until you can verify it, and at which point then you can say, okay, yes, this is good, we can go ahead and proceed. Now, depending on the kind of nesting that you're doing with your functions, validating the input on every single function potentially could have a decent amount of overhead depending on what kind of objects you're passing around. Now, if you're just passing around simple like integers and strings and whatnot, that's fairly easy for the most part to just try to do a basic check on them. Strings, of course, is a bit more complex, because it really depends on what you're doing with the string. If you're obviously if you're piping that into a system command, you really need to make sure that that's actually legitimate before you do that. Um, but yeah, otherwise it's just good practice to make sure that you validate everything before you actually, do something with it. And the good thing about that is, if you know what kind of objects you're expecting, it's really easy to write just a single function that can handle all those checks for you and then return, a true or false value, and basically kill the execution right then and there if it fails the validation. And you can kind of help save yourself from these various failure to sanitize type vulnerabilities, where you can either have a code injection, a buffer overflow, whatever the case is. Always making sure you validate your input is a fantastic way to protect yourself from a large number of these common vulnerabilities, because even memory safe languages are not immune to command injection vulnerabilities, which stem from a similar issue to buffer overflows, for instance, which is failing to validate your user input. In the case of a buffer overflow, it might not necessarily be your user's input was invalid, but it was just too long for the buffer you're sticking it in. But again, that kind of goes back to ensuring you validate the input coming in to make sure that you have enough room in your buffer to stick said input. But yeah, so that was the cybersecurity tip for the week. Update your Cisco devices ASAP, because they have two 10 out of 10 CVEs that need to be patched as quick as you can. And with that, let's move into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. So I had another $1 million idea, probably multi-million-dollar idea if we're being honest. So auto companies out there, take notes. So here is the sales pitch. Cruise control, but instead of constant speed, constant throttle input. And you can call this eco cruise control or something like that, because if you've ever used cruise control before, cruise control is great because, well, I guess it depends on the kind of cruise control you have. Dumb cruise control, which I've affectionately called cruise control that doesn't keep you in your lane or slow down when you get close to other cars. Dumb cruise control is pretty fantastic for just cruising on the highway and not having to have too much worry. You can easily change lanes and you can fairly easily maintain your constant speed. Smart cruise control, or more commonly known as adaptive cruise control, is what's in basically every modern car nowadays. It's this idea where the car will maintain a certain speed, but then if it gets within a certain distance of the car in front of it, it will slow down. And other variations as well can keep you centered in your lane so you don't kind of like drift out and whatnot. So this is good, but it has a very glaring issue, which we have talked about before on the podcast, and that is it's not good at maintaining your speed and allowing you to pass other vehicles, because the problem is if the car in front of you is going ever so slightly slower than you are, your car will start slowly creeping up to them, and you're like, okay, I'm getting ready to put my turn signal on and pass them, and then next thing you know, you're going the same speed as them and you can't pass them. And you're like, oh, well, I guess maybe they sped up or something and I can't pass them, only for you to look down at your speedometer and you're doing less than what your cruise control was set to. So then you kind of let out a sigh, hit the turn signal, go over a lane, and then your car speeds back up, allows you to pass the car, and then you can get back over. So it's fine if you don't care about potentially sitting behind slower traffic and having to speed up in order to pass cars, but both of them, adaptive cruise control and dumb cruise control, are horrible for fuel economy. And the reason they're horrible for fuel economy is they don't understand the concept of hills. So, if you've ever driven a car with cruise control set, if you start going down a hill, the car will start like braking for you. So, in order for you to maintain that same speed that you set, which that's good, I guess, to make sure that you don't break the speed limit, let's say. But the issue with that is then when you have to go back up the hill, all your momentum that you would have gained going down the hill, you don't have anymore because you were braking that entire time. So then you have to add even more throttle to go up the hill, in which case makes your fuel economy a lot worse. So my proposal is you have call it an eco cruise control, where instead of setting the certain speed that you want to go, you set a certain amount of throttle input you want to give. So in this case, when you're going up and down hills, when you're going down the hills, your car will speed up, and then when you go up the hills, you're basically just burning off the speed that you gained and getting back to where you were, and thus having some better fuel economy. So what do you think, automakers? All I'm asking is for a small, we can negotiate on the royalty fees, but just a very, very minor, small percentage of every car sold with this idea and royalty fees comes to me, and you can have at it. That's all I ask. So yes, potentially multi-million dollar idea right here, because think of the fuel savings alone, right? Like imagine how much gas you could save by, even if it's only like 5 miles a gallon difference, or maybe it's 3 miles a gallon difference. That over the course of a extended, very long road trip can add up to be a significant amount in fuel savings. So, I mean, I think it's a pretty fantastic idea, but I'd be interested to hear what others think of it. So if you have any comments, you can of course leave a comment below if you're on YouTube, or you can shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. Again, automakers, feel free to reach out about this fantastic idea, this amazing business proposition. um, now actually getting into what nerdy stuff I actually did. So I updated my network diagram, which, if we're being honest, is very long overdue. I still had my iPhone listed as running iOS 18, and iOS 26 has been out for several months now. I checked the git commit history on the network diagram, and it had been over a year since I last updated it, so it was definitely time for a revamp. It still had a server in there that I had since decommissioned and got rid of, so yeah, it definitely needed an update. Some things got moved around. Software OS versions had changed, so yeah, it definitely needed an update. And it was one of those things where it's not something I'm usually thinking about, and then the occasional times where I did think about it, I was like, "Oh, it's so outdated. It's gonna be so much work. I just don't really want to do that right now." So then it just kind of got kicked further and further down the road. But I did finally decide to actually update it, and it looks pretty great now that everything's updated now, and I'm pretty happy with it. And the next thing was another the first I will the first new addition to the home lab in probably a year and a half ish or so. I'm not exactly sure on the timeline, but definitely it's been over a year since we had a new edition. Although I should caveat that because this new edition is still technically not even in commission yet. It's not in use at the moment. Thank you very much, Ram Shortage. We really appreciate you. But I ended up buying another Dell R730, which is very unfortunate considering the current RAM pricing situation, which we talked about, I believe, last episode. Um, yeah, it's or maybe the episode before that. We talked about it semi recently. It's a very unfortunate situation because RAM prices are basically unobtainium. If you want a large quantity of RAM, it's in the realm of in order to get a reasonable amount of RAM for a server, you're basically spending as much money on the RAM as you did on the server. So the value proposition there isn't nearly as good as it was, say, 2 or 3 years ago. Because I mentioned in that previous episode that what I paid for 4 sticks of DDR4 ECC RAM, I can basically get one of those now for the same price. So, and that's like just one perspective. Like there is some ranges where I couldn't even get one stick for that price. The one stick would be twice the price of what I paid for four, and it's just completely out of control. Thank you very much, AI Bubble. But the server in question is and the reason I bought it was I could not resist the killer deal I found on a Google G100 R730 variant. Now, the Google G100 is a Google search appliance, which was like I it wasn't really a custom server by Google. It was just a Dell R7 series server that had some custom Google logos on it and stuff. So it's not like your standard Dell box. It's like all yellow, has Google on it, has a custom like front plate. It looks I think it's I just think it looks really cool. It's kind of like an Xserve in a way where they're not very common. It's more of a novelty thing. It's not something that you see very frequently. And comparatively, they're, let's just say, overpriced. They're not necessarily a good deal if you're just looking for a server, right? And the other thing is the R730s, they do exist, obviously, but they're not nearly as common, at least in my experience in looking at these, as compared to, say, the R720s or even the R710s. But the reason why the R730 is so good, in my opinion, is because it's still a viable platform in the modern day. Because the one big bummer about the Xserve is, yes, it looks incredibly cool. It's so amazing, but it's not really usable today. Um, Technically, I think you can still run modern Mac OS on it, but depending on the version of Xserve you have, you're like basically even further kneecapped because in one of the more recent Mac OS versions, I want to say it was Sonoma, I think. Um, there was an update to Mac OS that basically the patcher, the open core legacy patcher, basically had to turn off and disable one of the CPUs on the Xserve. So you're basically running it only with only one of the CPUs, which even further handicaps its performance, which is a real bummer. And then of course you could always run an older operating system, but then you kind of leave yourself open for potential vulnerabilities for unpatched, unsupported software. So yeah, and it's also insanely loud, very power inefficient, and it's not it's not going to run any service um that you actually would want to run it. It's just not powerful enough. And like I said, it's also very loud, and yeah. So the nice thing about the R730 is it's still a relatively modern platform, still has support for things. Its, CPUs that it runs aren't all that inefficient. They're pretty good. It uses pretty modern RAM, DDR4, so the RAM's going to be more efficient. And just overall, it's a better power to performance proposition than the Xserve is, and it is still absolutely usable. I have a R730 running in my rack right now that's serving as my NAS, and it's granted, I kind of kneecapped it intentionally to get its power drawdown, so it only has one CPU rather than two. But keep in mind, it only has one CPU, but it has 6 spinning disk drives in it, and it's only drawing like I think 100 and it's not even drawing 130 watts from the wall. So all that being said, they're fairly power efficient, all things considered. Now, are they power efficient? No, not really. But when it comes to rack mounted server gear, they're pretty dang good. So that was one of the reasons I bought it, because it's a fairly modern platform. So whenever I can get RAM for it, it can actually be a pretty good server. And also I just thought it looked cool, just kind of like I thought the Xserve looked cool. And I don't have to worry about Google's spyware being on it because it didn't come with any drives. The only thing it came with was two power supplies, two CPUs, and that was it. Understandably, the RAM that came with the server was salvaged at some point and probably sold off elsewhere because how lucrative it was. Wouldn't surprise me if the RAM being sold elsewhere probably made just as much money, if not more, than actually selling the server, which is kind of mind-boggling. But yeah, I just thought it looked cool, and I've been kind of eyeing these things for a while. Like I've been every now and then I'll check eBay to see what the Google G100 servers are going for, and usually I can't really find anything. Usually there might only be a couple listings tops, and a lot of the time it's some seller from some random country that's wanting to sell it for like basically 3 grand with shipping, and it's like absolutely not. That is not even close to a good value. um and even still nowadays, like there are insane markups for these things. So now granted, if I actually had the amount of RAM that came with it, with the price of RAM these days, it probably would still be around the same lucrative, insane price point. But I don't really have a strong use case for it because my home lab is doing everything I need it to do right now. It's not like I'm scrapping for resources. So it's basically just sitting on the floor right now. I do need to order rails for it so I can get it in the rack, but yeah, it's just kind of chilling right now. I don't really have a strong use case or need for it, so I don't really have an incentive to get ripped off on RAM prices. So it's just gonna kind of sit and look cool, just kind of like the Xserve does, until I can get some affordable RAM for it. But in the meantime, yeah, that was it's fun to finally get one of those because, like I said, I've been kind of eyeing them for several years now, which is kind of ironic in a way because I talk so much about my despise for Google on this podcast, yet here I am buying a Google server. But in fairness to me, maybe this is me just huffing the copium and to try to not think myself as a hypocrite. Uh, at the end of the day, the Google G100 server is just a Dell R730 with essentially Google branding on top of it, because I don't have the original drives for it, so I don't have the original search appliance operating system and tool suite that came with it, although I'm pretty sure that entire thing has been kind of reverse engineered and open source now, so if you wanted to run it, you could. I have no intentions to, for obvious reasons. But my plan for it was, whenever I get RAM for it, to essentially just turn it into another hypervisor. Potentially maybe replace the R620 down the line. But I mean, the R620 is still chugging along. It's doing everything I need it to, so I'm not really in a hurry to do that, especially with the price of RAM these days. The other thing I did was I was experimenting more with threading and cache optimization. So we talked a while on the podcast about the importance of understanding CPU architecture and the idea of cache misses versus cache hits, and how optimizing for cache hits can significantly improve your performance, and having a significant number of cache misses can severely hinder your performance. And this week, I was kind of experimenting around with this. The technical term for what I was playing around with was false sharing. So essentially, what this means in layman's terms is two variables that are close together in memory, or essentially share the same cache line. CPUs can't keep that cache all to themselves. So, from a low level architecture perspective, when a CPU loads memory, it has different levels of cache, right? And it can only fit so much data in each one of those levels of cache. And it usually takes this data in what's called cache lines, which is essentially just a line of memory addresses that it'll load into its cache. So the issue is if you have two variables that are very close together and end up in the same cache line, and that cache line is used across multiple CPUs, the issue is that CPUs have this idea of cache coherence protocols, which is essentially a way to ensure that they're not overwriting data and they keep their cache lines in sync. So, if you're using data and variables that are so close together they're in the same cache line but are used by two separate threads or two separate CPUs, the CPUs basically have to take overhead in order to make sync up and make sure those cache lines are in sync before they can continue their execution. So you're essentially getting a cache miss without actually getting a cache miss, because you get a performance hit similar to a cache miss, even though that you're still technically in cache. So as we discussed previously, cache misses isn't something that your compiler can optimize for you. So even if you use the highest level of optimization, your program could still get absolutely smoked by a program running with debug flags and no optimization if that version is cache optimized. Which is kind of insane if you think about it, because most people think, oh, I'll just throw the optimization flags with the compiler and everything will be good as gold, which not really the case when it comes to cache optimization. Cache optimization is definitely an art form that you have to understand CPU architecture in order to implement it and be good at it. Um, Now, when it comes to ensuring that, uh, variables don't end up in the same cache line, there's no really good way to do this that's portable. So, but a general rule of thumb is, as long as your variables are aligned on 64 byte, like basically 64 bytes away from each other, you're probably going to be good, but it's very dependent on the architecture that you're running your code on. So while 64 bytes might work on one architecture, it might not work on another one. And the other thing you could do is you can query how big your cache lines are with the code itself. But again, there's not really a portable way of doing that. And it will tend to vary between OS to OS on how you can actually query that information. But again, this is just another example of why understanding computer architecture as a software engineer or a software developer is so important. because it can be the difference between saving, multiple seconds. Because as we've discussed when talking about cache, a cache miss, a singular cache miss on its own isn't really that big of a deal. Like, in the grand scheme of things, if you had two pieces of code run and you timed them both and one had a cache miss and the other didn't, the execution time is basically going to be negligible. But once you compound all of those minor hits in performance, that's where you really start to see this compounding. And like I said, if you're trying to, like, say, process something, like if you're, running a server for something and you have a bunch of cache misses, that's going to significantly increase your latency and how many clients you can respond to, greatly reduce your transactions per second or your TPS. And if you're running a service, you want your server to be as optimized as possible to be handle as many requests as possible. So if you're running into, say, cache misses or running into false sharing operations, you're going to take a serious hit to your performance, and adding compiler flags is not going to fix your issue. You have to go into the code and understand where you're hitting these potential cache misses and, false sharing scenarios, and actually manually optimize it yourself. Like back in the old days, when compilers didn't have as good of optimizations as they did, you kind of had to do it yourself. So it's just, it's just something that, even if you don't necessarily live in the embedded systems world or live in the world of having to squeeze every ounce of performance out that you can, understanding these concepts will make you write, better code, better performant code, and just overall, it's just good to know. Now, the last thing really isn't something nerdy, but it does technically deal with electronics, sort of, so I figured I'd include it here. Um, but something you don't realize if you drive your car every day, especially in the wintertime, is that your car batteries need to be charged. Otherwise, they will drain and your car won't start. Now, I'm not talking about EVs here because that's kind of a given with those. I'm talking about real, all American, freedom sounding, gasoline consuming internal combustion engines. By far one of the best sounds in the world. When your car doesn't start, then you just do a simple fix like charging the battery, and then you go to start it, and then just like that, it lets freedom ring. Now, bonus points here if anyone can identify what car that was from. You can either leave a comment down below or you can shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. Bonus points if you can get it. Actually, we can do that as trivia question part 2, as a matter of fact. What car was that? Which I'm not going to give the answer at the end, so hopefully you can figure it out. Now on to the Apple news. So Apple had multiple announcements this week, but let's start off with their chips. So they announced the new M5 Pro and M5 Max chips this week. They're touting a brand new multi-die chip design, which they're calling the Fusion architecture. Now, this is very similar to what other chip manufacturers do, like what AMD does, for instance, with some of their server chips. They do what's called a chiplet design, which is essentially making smaller individual chips and then just kind of gluing them together. And the reason why this is such a good way of doing chip design is because you get better yields. And essentially what that means is if you wanted to create a really large chip with a bunch of cores, that's a lot of silicon real estate that you have to take up, and one small defect could either force you to throw the entire chip away or have to bin it and sell it as a lower SKU chip, which, when you're talking about some of these really big chips, that can be very, very inefficient. So if you can make the chips smaller and kind of glue them together to scale them that way, that makes your yields a lot higher because, yeah, say out of like 20 chips, say 2 go bad, but you can still form a bunch of chips out of the remaining 18. But in contrast, if you needed, say, 10 of those chips to create a single chip because two of them went bad. Now you can only get one chip. Or depending on where the chips went bad, you might not get any. So the fact that you can kind of create these little chiplets, as they're called, which are like smaller chips, and kind of glue them together, it makes your yields a lot better. So it makes the actual chip manufacturing process a lot more efficient. Now, both of the Pro and the Max chips have the same CPU, albeit the Pro chip has a binned version of it, which I don't think they've actually done this for the past two generations. I know when they first started with the M1 and the M2, they were basically the same, but then I want to say it was with the M3 generation, or maybe it was the M4. They started kind of having a slightly higher skewed CPU for the Max chip versus the Pro chip, but it seems they've kind of gone back to having them both be the same. So if you're just strictly focused on CPU performance, that's basically your go ahead to just get the Pro chip. Even the high, like just get the higher binned Pro chip, and you get the same CPU performance. Most likely, we haven't seen the benchmarks yet, but most likely you get the same CPU performance as you would with the Max chip. But they also changed their naming convention for the chips. So before they had performance cores and efficiency cores, but now they're calling them super cores and all new performance cores. Um, so it seems that the super cores are faster than the previous performance cores, and the quote all new performance cores, which is very confusing, are somewhere in between like the old efficiency cores, but also the old performance cores. They kind of seem to be somewhere in between. Apple touts that they're, more efficient, but also better optimized for like multi-threaded workloads. So I guess they did something with the chip architecture. I'm not sure if that's just like a marketing thing they're doing, or if there's actually some significant difference there. But the Pro chip comes in two different variations for the CPU. It has 15 cores or 18 cores. The 18 core variant is obviously the higher end one. The 15 core variant is the binned one. The Max also gets the 18 core variant. At least for the 18 core variant, it gets 6 of the super cores and 12 of the all performance cores. Conveniently, Apple didn't mention the core counts for the 15 core one, and the only reason you can figure out that there is a 15 core one is if you go to the configurator and try to build one yourself. Now, as far as performance goes, Apple's touting a 30% CPU performance gains for quote unquote pro workloads, whatever that means. I'm guessing probably like because they were talking about like improved multi-threaded performance. I'm assuming pro workloads means like very highly threaded applications, like lots of threads going on for high performance computing would be my assumption. um the GPU comes with 16 or a 20 core variant for the Pro line, and the Max comes with either a 32 or a 40 core variant. Now, Apple is touting a 4 times peak GPU compute for AI with their new neural engine processors, like in each GPU core, and a total of 35% gains for ray tracing over the M4 generation. Now, supposedly that 4 times peak GPU compute is based on the equivalent GPU. That's at least that's how I read it from their press release. So the you could expect a 4 times increase in AI performance on the Pro chip, for the M5 Pro chip, as you would compared to the M4 Pro chip, and then you'd see a 4 times increase in the same performance from the Max chip versus M5 Max chip versus the M4 Max chip. That's at least how I read it. Both also get a memory bandwidth increase too, which is kind of nice to see. Now, they also, in addition to this, released multiple new devices. The first being the Studio Display and a new Studio Display XDR. Gotta love the naming conventions. Both of these displays get Thunderbolt 5, but the XDR display gets a 120 hertz refresh screen, whereas the regular Studio Display is still stuck with 60. Both, of course, are still 5K and 27 inches. Apple is touting an improved webcam, microphone, and speaker performance. The regular Studio Display is coming in at $15.99, and the XDR display is coming in at $32.99. Now, don't get me wrong, Apple's displays are really good. But over 3 grand for a monitor, in my opinion, is a little steep. Especially considering the fact that you can easily find 4K 120 hertz monitors for under $300, and you can even find 5K displays with even higher refresh rates than what the Studio Display XDR offers for under 1,000. So yeah, are they gonna be the same quality display, have a camera, microphone, speakers, and all that stuff? Probably not. Um, but at the same time, with how much money you save on getting a different display, you could probably get fairly comparable, if not better, peripherals. Now, you can also make the argument that, yeah, you could get better peripherals, but then you have a bunch more cables and wires hanging around, and just the all in one solution is a lot nicer aesthetically, which I do agree with. But that is a very steep price to pay for just an aesthetic, better visuals, I guess. Now, there's a lot more to the aesthetics of an Apple monitor than just the fact that the webcam, microphone, and speakers are all built into it. I mean, just the overall look of the display in general is very, very nice. In front of me, have a 27-inch Thunderbolt display from like the 2010s, which sadly, I think it has finally decided to kick the bucket because I had been dealing with this issue for a long time, several years now, where I would have the monitor plugged in and it would just kind of sometimes flicker or just turn itself off. What looks like turn itself off, the display would just go dark. And then I would have to play this game of like unplugging it and plugging it back in, and then eventually it would come back to life. But that trick doesn't seem to be working anymore. So I think I will actually have to get a new monitor here at some point, which is definitely a bummer because the Thunderbolt display is a fantastic display. Um, and I was thinking, maybe you get a studio display, but the thing is, like, paying essentially the same amount of money for a computer as you would for your monitor, just it's hard for me to justify that. Now, hopefully with this maybe new release of the studio display, maybe like the used market will kind of become cheaper for like the older models. Maybe not, who knows. I mean, there is of course the idea of buy once cry once, which I do like to subscribe to, but that's still a very steep premium to pay, for essentially an Apple monitor when you realistically, if you're just doing like standard work and stuff, you don't necessarily need the most accurate color accuracy or, the best this, the best that. You just kind of need a monitor. Speakers would be nice. I mean, that kind of a premium is kind of hard to justify. But the other thing of it too is if you really wanted a 5K Apple display and spend as little money as possible, your best option is still to just buy an old 5K iMac, gut it, and then convert it into an external display, which you can do. And all in, that'll run between the converter board, the iMac itself, and then if you wanted to throw a webcam in there, because one of the bummers of converting an iMac into a display is the webcam, speakers, and microphone don't work anymore. So you kind of lose out on that, which is kind of a bummer. Um, but the nice thing is you can easily get a little small webcam to basically stick behind the display to kind of at least get a webcam back. But of course, that would also be extra. But I mean, all in, you're probably looking at somewhere between like 500 to 550, like if you wanted to DIY it yourself. Now you also could probably get like an LG Ultrafine as well. Those are a lot cheaper than studio displays. Um, but yeah, obviously the iMac route, that's a lot more DIY. And one of the common cautions that people like to mention with the iMac is once you get into one of those, especially with the 5K iMacs, is the power supply is basically right there. So you really have to be cautious when you're working on those things to not basically electrocute yourself. But if you do have the technical know-how and the tools to do it, it is a decent option if you want to have a pretty custom and cool like centerpiece on your desk. Will I do it? Probably not. But seeing that this Thunderbolt display seems to have officially kicked the bucket, I probably will be in the monitor uh, shopping area. I will probably be looking for one soon because with how the desk is currently set up, it's very annoying now because the Thunderbolt display is right in the middle, and then there's two monitors on either side. So there's no working monitor in the middle anymore. So it's very annoying. I haven't removed the Thunderbolt display from the desk yet. So, yeah, there's just this big black screen in the middle. So it's very sad to look at. But I will probably be in the market here shortly for a new display at some point. What it'll be, I don't know, but I will look at my options. But that was kind of way off topic. Let's get back to the Apple products that got announced. They unveiled I guess, a tech refreshed iPad Air. Got the M4 chip, so that's pretty cool. They announced the iPhone 17e. It got a chip bump to the A19. It gets MagSafe, which it's kind of funny that that's a headlining feature. Since iPhones have had MagSafe for forever, but the iPhone 16e, which came out last year, did not have MagSafe, so it gets MagSafe now. That's cool, I guess. Starts now at 256 gigs of storage instead of 128. It gets the new 48 megapixel fusion camera that debuted this past fall on the iPhone 17s, but it does not get the center stage camera, so that I guess if that matters to you. But yeah, that's about it. Otherwise, it's basically more or less the same. Now, when it comes to the Macs, all of the Macs get a storage increase, but they also get a slight price increase. Now, there's a couple theories behind this. One is they increase the storage, so they're obviously increasing the price because Apple loves to charge for their storage upgrades. The other one is with how insane RAM prices are and how much RAM prices might be eating into their bottom line, they figure, we'll give them an attaboy, give them some extra storage, and raise the price a little bit, but not as much as what that storage upgrade would cost. So it looks like we're giving them a deal, but in reality, we're just kind of compensating for how much extra we're having to pay for this RAM. So whatever the reason is, all the Macs across the board get increased storage, but also slight price increases as well. So the MacBook Air now gets the M5 chip. Its base storage increases from 256 to 512. It does get a $100 price increase, but technically that's still cheaper than if you bought an M4 and paid the upgrade fee to 512 gigs. Now, yes, that might just be me huffing the Apple fanboy copium, but that's also just a fact. The M4 MacBook Air with 200 or with 512 gigs was $11.99, whereas the new MacBook Air is $10.99. So you do technically save $100 if you want to look at it that way. The RAM, however, is unchanged, so you're still at 16 gigs. But once these things start going on sale and you can get them for maybe like $850 or $900, it's going to be a pretty good deal because I bought my M4 MacBook Air kind of well into its cycle. So there were definitely some sales going on, and I got the 512 variant for $1,000, so basically saved myself $200. So in a few months, once these things start going on sale on places like Best Buy, Amazon, those kinds of places, it's going to be some pretty good deals once you can get, the 512 M5 MacBook Air for say like $900. That'll be a pretty good deal. MacBook Pros also receive price increases, but the space storage on all the models has increased. All the MacBook Pros now start at 1 TB, except for the Max variants that start with 2 TB. I guess it also goes without saying that with the announcement of the new M5 Pro and M5 Max chips, those also come to the MacBook Pros. And then the new MacBook that got announced, which everyone seems to be talking about, at least in the tech sphere. If you're not in the tech sphere, probably nobody's talking about this because that's how the internet works. The MacBook Neo. Now, design-wise, it basically looks like a MacBook Air without a notch, which gotta love it. Love the fact it doesn't have a notch. One thing that's really weird, though, is the headphone jack is like at the bottom of the device. So it's like below the keyboard on the left side of the device, which is kind of weird, especially because there's no ports in between there. Of course, you have the two USB-C ports up at the top on the left, which, by the way, there's no MagSafe, so it just has two USB-C ports. But yeah, the headphone jack, I don't know. For me, it just kind of looks to be in a really odd spot, but maybe that's just me. Um, the USB-C ports, no Thunderbolt. One of them is USB 3, one of them's USB 2, which I guess kind of makes sense considering the chip that's in this thing, which we'll get to in a second. But the thing that I like the most about this new MacBook Neo is the fact that it does not have a notch. I think the notch is an eyesore. It's horrible. I don't know why it's the size of Texas, but all it has is a small little webcam in there. The size never made any sense to me, but I still don't know. I mean, I guess the whole idea was to get a little bit more real estate up at the top of the screen, but I don't know. I just never liked the notch. My go-to with my MacBook Air and my work laptop that also is a Mac that has a notch, is to basically install the top notch add-on, which basically turns the entire top, where the menu bar is up there, just turns it all black so the notch basically blends in and you can't see it, which makes me happier. Now, the other interesting thing is there had been rumors for a while about this device, and it was essentially going to be the successor to the legendary 12-inch MacBook. Now, I say legendary kind of jokingly because the 12-inch MacBook was absolutely terrible. It throttled like crazy, and it was basically unusable from the beginning because the Intel chip in it was basically always overheating. It had the butterfly keyboard. It had it had a single USB-C port, which I think had some failure issues. It was a mess, but people loved it because of how small and light it was. And this MacBook Neo was kind of in the rumor mill for a while. And it finally came out, but it's basically the same dimensions as the MacBook Air. Its footprint is ever so slightly smaller, although not much, but it is a tiny bit thicker as well. So the MacBook Air is still your go-to if you want thinness. As far as the weight's concerned, they weigh the exact same. So, I mean, it's basically a MacBook Air essentially, except it has slightly thicker bezels and yeah, and it has a different chip and less configuration options. So, but the footprint is still basically the same. Now, this is where we get to the interesting stuff because this MacBook Neo starts at $599, and if you have the education discount, it's $499. So basically $600 or $500 for the education discount, which is basically an unbeatable value for everything that you get here. Now, is that me just being an Apple fanboy and huffing the copium? Probably, but it comes with the A18 Pro chip, and you only get 8 gigs of RAM, so you can't upgrade the memory at all. But it does, the base storage is 256 gigs with no Touch ID, which is rather interesting. And then if you upgrade to the 512 gigs of storage, which is the max you can get on this thing, then it comes with Touch ID, and that's a $100 upgrade. Now, personally, I think it's probably worth doing the $100 upgrade because one, you get 512 gigs of storage, which is always nice, plus you get Touch ID. So I think those two combined is probably worth $100 in my opinion, especially considering that that only puts you at $700 or $600 if you're getting it with the education discount. They also claim to have a battery life of 16 hours. So the value proposition here is to find a PC laptop that meets all of the same specs as the MacBook Neo is basically impossible. Now, you can find Windows computers that will have more storage, maybe more memory, maybe a slightly faster CPU, but it won't have all of the things, right? It won't have a better display and more memory and and more storage and a better CPU and better battery life. It's basically maybe pick one or two of those things. Um Plus, the build quality is probably going to be better on the MacBook Neo. Um, but when it comes to the other, I guess, notable thing about this laptop is the keyboard is not backlit and the trackpad is not a Force Touch trackpad, which is rather interesting because Force Touch trackpads have been a thing since like 2015. So why they opted to remove it, I'm not entirely sure because it's on the MacBook Air. I can't imagine it's that big of a savings to not put a Force Touch trackpad in there, but who knows? Um, the one thing that's interesting is it's a little unclear on what exactly this trackpad is. It's considered a multi-touch trackpad. I don't think it's a diving board mechanism, but it's also not like the haptic feedback like the Force Touch trackpad is, so it will actually physically go down. So it'll be interesting to see how that actually works. But yeah, it is interesting that they're not going with a Force Touch trackpad even after that's been standard since basically 2015. So not sure about that. But if you're just looking for a laptop to, browse the internet, reply to emails, do basic office tasks like Word documents, PowerPoint, spreadsheets, that kind of a thing, this thing is basically unbeatable. It's basically top notch. Like if you're thinking of potentially getting a Chromebook for that, don't even think about it because, well, first off, don't even think about it because it's Google, but also don't even think about it because the value proposition is just way better on the MacBook Neo. But here is where we get to the interesting point of discussion, which is, will it cannibalize iPad sales? Because at the price point that the MacBook Neo is in, Apple is, at least in my opinion, is making it very hard to justify the iPad's existence. Now, of course, the iPad's always going to have its use cases. No Mac has a touchscreen, so if you need a touchscreen, iPad is obviously going to be the way to go. If you need it for like illustration purposes, the iPad is still top notch. So it's not like the iPad is going to become obsolete because of the MacBook Neo by any stretch of the imagination. But the value proposition for a basic device with a slightly larger screen to do basic internet related tasks or just basic computing tasks, the iPad basically doesn't have the value anymore. Because let's take a look at the different iPads and the value proposition. So the base iPad and even the iPad mini both come in under the base MacBook Neo. So you could technically argue that they're cheaper and can do what you needed to do. Sure. But here's where it gets interesting because even though that, yes, the iPad and the base iPad and the iPad mini are cheaper, they also have a less powerful chip with the A16 and A17 Pro in the iPad and iPad mini respectively versus the A18 Pro that's in the Neo. They have a less capable OS, a smaller screen, a significantly smaller screen in the case of the iPad mini, less storage and less RAM, at least in the case of the base iPad. The iPad mini has the same 8 gigs. So, assuming you don't opt for a keyboard or Apple Pencil for it, at best, you're saving $250 with the base iPad or only $100 with the iPad mini. And that's assuming you don't opt for like the keyboard case or the Apple Pencil. And you're just but if you do get those things, you're going to be spending just as much money, if not more, than you would on the MacBook Neo. And I would argue an iPad with the keyboard case is a doesn't have the same capabilities as a MacBook, right? Because the MacBook can do so much more because it's not limited by iPad OS. Now, yes, iPad OS has come a long way in recent years in becoming, more multitask friendly, allowing you to have different windows and such, but it still doesn't allow you to do things that a desktop operating system would allow you to do. You can't, at least for a developer's perspective, you can't really edit code. I mean, I guess you technically could find some workarounds with an iPad to do it. You can't run Xcode, you can't, you know, do all the cool terminal things that you can with a Mac. You can't install third party applications that aren't in the App Store. There's a lot of things that the Mac gives you in terms of flexibility that an iPad just cannot do. So I think Mac OS alone is worth the $250 that you would be saving, quote unquote, saving with just getting the base iPad, not to mention all of the other additional things you get along with upgrading to the MacBook. The better chip, more RAM, more storage, bigger screen, all that stuff. Now, the value proposition, in my opinion, gets even worse once you look at the iPad Air and the iPad Pro, because those models, in the case of the base iPad Air, the 11-inch screen model, it's the same price as the Neo. Obviously, the larger screen is going to be more, and then the iPad Pro obviously is, even the cheapest iPad Pro is more expensive than the iPad Neo. Now, sure, on those iPads, you do get a more powerful chip in an M series chip, that being, the M4 or the M5. But again, you're still struck with the hindrance and the issue of it being iPad OS and the limitations that that brings. Because you are going to be very hard pressed to find any kind of hardware limitation with iPad OS with any of these new chips. Not just me, but others have been saying this for years. iPads aren't limited by their hardware, they're limited by their software. Now, like I said, iPad OS has definitely come a long way in the past couple years, but again, for the most basic of tasks, I don't see the value proposition in getting an iPad Air or iPad Pro when you can have all the things that you need a computing device to do with the iPad or with the MacBook Neo, and basically save yourself some money. Now, again, there are still definitely use cases for the iPad, right? If you like the touchscreen, you like typing on the touchscreen, iPad is still going to be your go-to. If you need it for, drawing things like you're an illustrator or something, again, the iPad is still killer for that. It's not going to be beat by a Mac anytime soon. So there are still definitely reasons why you would want to buy an iPad over a MacBook. But for the general computing task for basic things like browsing the internet, working on like office type documents, responding to emails, that kind of a thing, which is kind of like the most basic form of computing that most people do, the value proposition of the iPad really isn't there anymore. Because back in the day, Apple had this whole like, what is a computer campaign with the iPad. And back then, for basic computing tasks, yes, an iPad could absolutely replace your laptop. But now, yes, the iPad could still technically replace your laptop, but in most of the cases nowadays, it's technically not even the best value. Like, yeah, you could use an iPad instead of a MacBook, but the MacBook's the better value. So why would you do that, right? So a lot to think about. Like I said, I don't think that Apple coming out with the MacBook Neo is going to kill the iPad by any means, but I would not be surprised if the iPad Neo takes a chunk out of the iPad market share, because people will be cross shopping between, I just need a basic thing to do some basic computing tasks, and they will see the value proposition is better for the MacBook Neo and just get that instead. So, but again, it really is just kind of a muddying of the waters of sorts because of how close they are in price. But yeah, so the MacBook Neo, I think it's one of those devices that, if you think, is this enough for me? Like, it's one of those things that if you just need it for basic computing, it's fine. But if you need a little more than the MacBook Neo, then you probably need to upgrade to like a MacBook Air or maybe a MacBook Pro or something. But I would say for like, if you're a new like college student or a high school student, or you just need something to do the most basic of computing tasks, MacBook Neo is probably going to be your go-to there. So that was the Apple announcement on all the goodies. But before we go for today, we have to wrap up with our trivia question for the week. So, according to the GitHub repository for CVE.com, the first CVE submitted was CVE 1999-0211 on September 29th, 1999. But what was that CVE for? If you said SunOS's arbitrary read write vulnerability, congratulations, you got this week's trivia question correct. And I think that basically sums it up right there. The first CVE coming from the 90s, and it was for SunOS. Because I think that just kind of sums it up right there. It very 90s. I would think that a decent number of people, especially the younger audience, probably have no idea what SunOS even is. So if you do fall into that camp, I would encourage you to look it up. Also, it's kind of crazy that 1999 was, when the CVE thing kind of first got published, the first when CVE was kind of introduced, and CVE has been around longer than some people have been alive, which is kind of wild. Kind of makes me feel old a little bit. But that's going to do it for this episode. So if you enjoyed it, definitely make sure to leave it a rating and review and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And also be sure to share it with a friend or family member. And if you have any questions about this episode, or if you have any ideas, comments, or topics or ideas for future episodes, you can shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. Or if you're on YouTube, you can just leave a comment down below. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, fool nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.